The confrontation of a determined and aggressive invasion against a stubborn and staunch resistance results in an unprecedented massacre. During the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War, over 20 million Chinese civilians died as a result of attrition or massacres. The most infamous and brutal of these, that still causes many debates today, was the Nanking Massacre. After an escalation of hostilities between Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China and Emperor Hirohito's Empire of Japan, the former was forced into declaring war on the latter in July 1937. Almost immediately, Japan, that had garrisons in many cities in China, as well as strategic puppet states in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, launched a massive attack on Chinese territory. The northeast of the country rapidly fell into Japanese control. The Empire of the Rising Sun, under firm control of its military government, stated China would fall within 3 months. But Chiang Kai-shek, the general who had united his country a decade earlier, was determined never to surrender. He sent the best of his National Revolutionary Army forces to Shanghai to storm the international settlement, where several tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were stationed on the 12th of August 1937. The other nations who had concessions in the city, mainly France, Britain and the US, preferred to stay uninvolved. Go check out my video about the international settlement to learn more. The Japanese still held on, and by November, 200,000 reinforcements arrived, forcing the National Revolutionary Army to retreat. Shanghai, one of the richest cities in China, was captured. Following this victory, the Japanese military government agreed to launch a campaign to capture Nanjing, the capital city and seat of power of the Republic of China. As the Japanese hoped, many Chinese pleaded to Chiang Kai-shek to just retreat from the area, but the nationalist leader was determined not to let his symbolic capital city fall. In chaos, a garrison was raised, made mainly of local conscripts, and a few survivors of the Battle of Shanghai. Tang Shengzhi, an experienced general who had participated in the 1911 Shanghai Revolution, was appointed as leader of the Nanjing garrison force. The Japanese Central China Area Army, in charge of the operation, was led by Iwane Matsui. That general was also very experienced, having served during the Russo-Japanese War, but most importantly, was an expert of China. His forces swept through the countryside and arrived at the walls of Nanjing by the 9th of December. They started to circle the city. General Matsui, however, fell ill, and command was passed over to Prince Asaka, uncle by marriage of the Emperor of Japan. Inside the walls, about 80,000 mostly inexperienced Chinese soldiers, with a very low morale, and at least 300,000 civilians, anxiously waited for the next move of the enemy. On the 10th of December, the Japanese sent an ultimatum to the local Chinese force, ordering an unconditional surrender. Tang Shengzhi did not respond and told his men, "Our army has entered into the final battle to defend Nanking on the Foucault line. Each unit shall firmly defend its post with the resolve to either live or die with it. You are not allowed to retreat on your own, which would cause defense to collapse." At exactly 1 PM, the attack began. A full-scale attack on the city was launched, and all Japanese divisions poured in. There was little that the Chinese, both low in supply and equipment, could do against the mechanized forces, and heavy casualties were suffered on the defenders' side. In addition, several hundreds of Chinese soldiers who attempted to flee were shot down by their own army. In 2 days, the Chinese were overrun and lost control of most of the city. Chiang Kai-shek realized the situation was hopeless and ordered a full retreat. The Japanese had, however, encircled the city, so the remnants of Tang Shengzhi's forces would have to break through. On the 12th of December, practically all of the garrison had been killed or managed to escape with Tang. Many others had abandoned uniforms and arms and blended in with the civilians. Only a few dozens in pockets still held on. A demilitarized safety zone of about 5 square kilometers was established by foreigners living in the city to protect civilians. The committee in charge of the area was composed of businessmen, professors, doctors and missionaries from several Western countries, and led by a German businessman and local representative of the Nazi Party, John Rabe. I will display the names of every member at the end of the video. By the 13th of December, Nanjing was in full control of the Japanese, although the Safety Zone Committee held a minor authority in its area. In a strategic mopping-up operation, remaining pockets of resistance were destroyed, and civilians were thoroughly searched for any weapons or military equipment. about 4,000 alleged disguised soldiers were rounded up and executed. Due to the increasing propaganda since the last few decades, many Japanese thought of the Chinese as an inferior human group, while seeing themselves as the superior race. Furthermore, the Japanese military government wished to intimidate the rest of China into surrendering fast. It was decided that Nanjing was to be made into an example of unprecedented cruelty and brutality. During the capture of Nanjing, 2 Japanese officers, named Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, decided to have a contest between themselves. The objective was to behead 100 people first with their swords before the final capture of the city. Tokyo newspaper Nichi-Nichi Shimbun regularly covered their progress, branding it as a heroic action. When Nanjing fell on the 13th of December, Mukai had allegedly murdered 106 and Noda 105. Since they could not determine which officer had reached the goal first, they decided to continue the contest to 150. A day after, the Japanese started to pillage the mostly deserted city, not counting the safety zone, looting shops and houses, setting fire to buildings, and summarily executing Chinese civilians walking in the streets. A third of the city was destroyed in the flames. On the 17th of December, John Rabe wrote to the Japanese embassy for the first time of many, complaining about the absence of discipline of the Japanese army that freely roamed into the city to raid everything they could. The same day, General Matsui finally entered the city, having recovered from his illness. The next day he confessed to his aides that he was only beginning to realize the extent of the atrocities and that his personal feelings were moved. He nonetheless added that Japanese army had to continue unless China repented. The same day, in what would be known as the Strawstring Gorge Massacre, thousands of young Chinese men were arrested. They were taken to the riverbanks of the Yangtze and their hands were tied together. During the following hour, they were systematically gunned down, and any survivor was stabbed with bayonets. The bodies were all thrown into the river. On another occasion, the Japanese gathered 1,300 Chinese people and killed them with landmines and burning kerosene. In the same fashion, any survivor was stabbed. Bodies were disposed of by burning them, or in mass graves dug by the victims themselves or other civilians. In addition to the countless murders, thousands of Chinese women were raped during the period that followed the capture of the town. Although most victims were young women, children and the elderly were not spared either. The Imperial Japanese soldiers regularly searched houses for women, gang raped them and often killed them by mutilation with a bayonet afterwards. The American missionary Reverend James McCullum estimated that over 1,000 girls were raped every night, and many other during the daytime. The safety zone, although saving most civilians, was not enough to protect them all. On many accounts, the Japanese entered the safety zone and shot or kidnapped people. On the 17th of December, John Rabe recalls in his diary how some soldiers trespassed into the safety zone. 2 Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear, they give the excuse that they saw 2 Chinese soldiers climb over the wall. When I show them my party badge, they return the same way. In one of the houses in the narrow street behind my garden wall, a woman was raped and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we can take her to the Kulo hospital. Last night, up to 1,000 women and girls are said to have been raped, about 100 girls at Ginling College, alone. You hear nothing but rape. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality and bestiality of the Japanese soldiers. It is also reported that Chinese civilians were forced to rape others, including members of their own family or monks that had vowed chastity. Overall, more than 20,000 women were raped during the Nanjing Massacre. John Rabe and the rest of the International Committee regularly appealed to the Japanese embassy and army, but practically always in vain. The Nanjing Massacre continued until early 1938, where the Japanese created a new puppet state to administer the east of China that they had just conquered, known as the 中华民国维新政府, or Reformed Government of the Republic of China. The Japanese now controlled a great part of China with 4 puppet states, the others being Manchukuo in Manchuria, Mengjiang in Inner Mongolia, and the Provisional Government of the Republic of China. Civilians were forced to leave the safety zone and return to their homes. By the end of February, movement restrictions were lifted and inhabitants were allowed to move around the city again. Although many murders and brutalities continued, they became much rarer over the next few months and eventually stopped. John Rabe was ordered to return to Germany on the 28th of February. General Matsui was relieved of command and returned to Japan. Life gradually resumed for the civilians who, although traumatized, were still alive. In the course of a few months, it is estimated that between 200,000 and 300,000 people, the vast majority being civilians, lost their lives to the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army. A large part of the city was ransacked and destroyed. The bodies that were neither thrown in the Yangtze nor burnt by the Japanese were left on the streets and buried by the Chinese. A Hui minority, Chinese Muslims, lived in the city. They buried many bodies in the Islamic tradition. The Shiji Hongwanzi Hui, or Red Swastika Society, a Chinese voluntary association, and the Chongshan, a charity association, also assisted in burying tens of thousands of victims. Although the majority of Japanese soldiers and officers took an active or passive part in the massacre, it is likely that a few disapproved and helped the civilians. There are accounts of Japanese Christians offering support to civilians and engaging in religious ceremonies led by Westerners alongside the Chinese. The majority of survivors of the Nanjing Massacre were able to live thanks to the efforts of the International Committee of the Safety Zone. It is estimated that over 200,000 Chinese people's lives were saved. Most of them witnessed atrocities, and interviews of them can be found easily on YouTube. Concerning the Chinese soldiers, about 10,000, including General Tang, were able to safely retreat to the west, where they continued to fight against the Japanese. Only about 5,000 other Chinese soldiers who, unable to retreat, stayed either in Nanjing or in its vicinity, managed to escape death and survive the massacre. After the surrender of Japan in 1945, that ended both the Second Sino-Japanese War and Second World War, two tribunals were created: the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal, to judge the Japanese officers that partook the massacre. Amongst many others, General Matsui, Lieutenant Colonel Tani, an officer who had also participated in the atrocities, and officers Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, that had had the contest to behead 100 people with their swords, were all sentenced to death and executed. Prince Asaka, second in command at the Battle of Nanking, was granted immunity as a member of the imperial family. John Rabe went to prison in Germany, as his actions had been considered detrimental to the Nazi-Japanese alliance. After the war, as a member of the Nazi Party, he was arrested and interrogated by the Soviet intelligence, and later the British Army. He became broke after spending all of his savings in legal defense costs, and had to sell all of his Chinese art collection. The Rabe family, however, was destitute, living in a one-room apartment and eating wild seeds. By 1948, 10 years after he left China, the citizens of Nanjing learnt of his situation and raised funds to help him, as well as regularly sending him food. John Rabe died from a stroke on the 5th of January 1950. The Nanjing Memorial Hall of the Victims of the Massacre was created in 1985 to commemorate the event on the spot of a mass grave containing about 10,000 victims. The Nanjing Massacre is one of the darkest events of Chinese and world history. Although a minority, there are still people in Japan today who claim that it never happened, or minimize the reality. But Chinese survivors, the International Committee, and many Japanese themselves could serve as witnesses. Furthermore, many letters, diaries, and some rare films captured the tragic events that to this day remain a point of friction between China and Japan. Thank you for watching my video, I hope you could learn from it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the comment section below.